afternoon. My name is Pasha Baker. I'm the director and CEO of the Goldsboro Westside Community Historical Association Incorporated. And welcome to one of many Black History programs that we are bringing to you virtual. I have the pleasure of having Mr. Maxwell Stone here with us, a Sanford native, but also a person that has done a lot of research on the city of Sanford, on its dynamics, and more about what the Klan had, the role the Klan played here in Sanford and in the demise of Goldsboro and its Celery City, and how it uplifted itself to where it is today. So I want to thank Mr. Maxwell Stone for coming to join us for this presentation of Unmasking Klansford. Thank you, Maxwell, for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor.
And thank you for having your thesis and coming down here to present today for our Black History Special.
Yes, it's again a very nice honor to be here, and I'm very happy to present some, I think, important and undersold history.
Definitely. Black history matters. So if you would like, take it away. And your presentation is up for the people to view right now.
Indeed it is. Let's get underway here. And so the Klan is going to emerge in several contexts, and probably the most important one is celery. The celery industry transformed a city whose Black population and population in general was at roughly 1,400 residents as of 1900. By 1908, a decade after the first celery crop was planted, that population is going to bloom to roughly 3,500 residents. By 1920, over 5,000. And Sanford's population shifts as well. It was always majority white. By 1920, the opposite is true. And this is where the Klan's going to come into play. A year after Sanford's Black population eclipsed that of whites, Mayor Lake personally orchestrated a Klan rally on election eve because
the mayor instructed a Klan rally.
He did.
Mayor Lake.
He did.
Okay, so just to bring you into context, of course, the history of Goldsboro is very relevant. The history of Goldsboro, we started Goldsboro in 1891. It was started by Mr. William Clark, the brother of Joe Clark, who founded Edenville several years earlier, incorporated these two Black townships shortly after emancipation. So let's bring this full circle.
Right.
So we were emancipated when? 1865. Edenville was an incorporated city in 1877. 1891, his brother, the brother of Edenville, Joseph Clark, his brother William Clark, founded Goldsboro in 1891. Now, when did you say Celery City, Sanford became introduced as the Celery City? In what year?
1908 was when they officially
in
got
1908. So Goldsboro is still a city then. And then when did the Black population eclipse the white population in the city of Sanford?
1920.
1920. And in 1921 is when Mayor Lake stole the charter of Goldsboro. All right, this is going to be fun. Yeah, let's go, Maxwell.
All right, and just for some scale, when that celery market peaks in 1926, it's an $8 million a year crop for Sanford. That's $124 million a year. In
today's money or yesterday's money?
In 1926 money.
In 1926, the Celery City, the city of Sanford was the #1 exporter of celery.
Yep.
And was producing $8 million a year in 1928.
About $125 million in today's money.
That's a lot of money.
Florida was 1/3 of Florida was 73% of the U.S. celery market. Sanford was at 1/3 of that, to give some scale. And the average celery picker, by the way, 25 cents a day. 25 cents a day, which is
the labor.
Yep.
So the Blacks, of course, were the labor for celery. This is in the Jim Crow area. We had shortly been emancipated a few decades before this. And so many Blacks just struggled to make ends meet and find jobs wherever they could. Of course, those were the only jobs that were available to them, were picking celery in Celery City, which is the city of Sanford. And so the $8 million a year, and Blacks that were the labor for that celery made 8 cents per day.
25 cents a day, about
25 cents a day.
$91 a year.
$91 a year. And I do not want to break that down into hourly because that is just sad.
Exactly. And this Celery City is going to fuel the ambitions of Lake and Holly. Remember, at this point in time, Sanford is part of Orange County, or Mosquito County as it was.
That's right.
They want out.
Seminole County was not created yet.
But it gets there. And then we have the slide on Goldsboro.
Mm-hmm.
To give some scale, in 1904, the Miami News named Goldsboro the most unique town in all of Florida.
Wow. Shout out to our friends at Miami and Overtown. How are y'all?
And they highlighted the peaceful relationship Sanford and Goldsboro had in that newspaper article.
They highlighted the peaceful relationship,
Yes.
blacks and white. Okay.
And because Sanford Heights, which was a neighborhood in Sanford, petitioned the legislature for a separate town charter.
That's right.
And sewage ran downhill into Sanford. What they've got in that charter, Mayor Lake, who's also a legislator, and R.J. Holly, who founds, owns, and edits the Herald, engaged in a clandestine legislative campaign and induced the legislature to basically say, well, if we can issue charters, we can take them away. And despite the protestations of Goldsboro's residents, they did more than take it away. As we know, the streets were renamed. Mayor Lake vindictively named Clark Avenue after himself, Lake Drive, which stood until 2013.
Until we changed it back.
Yep. It's
Definitely.
a painful reminder of Mayor Lake's vindictiveness and Sanford's alleged.
And to throw it in our face that he stole the city of Goldsboro as well.
Exactly. And this was an enclave of independence in a Jim Crow South. And to have that taken away had to be incredibly painful. And for that to correspond with just 2 years after Goldsboro was stolen, the first lynching in Seminole County. First lynching in Seminole County.
All right. So I want to go back to what you were saying. So one thing that we want to highlight is that the mayor of the city of Sanford, Mayor Lake, orchestrated, but also how important it is for the media to be honest in journalism. What we see today, and a lot of the reasons why we are having such a robust Black History Month and why we do this every year, is because we often see history repeat itself. We've seen in the media about fake news. We've seen in the media about journalists being attacked during the Capitol riots. But here you have a person that owns the Sanford Herald that is telling a narrative that is not true. Yes. So that's how it's reflected in history. And so that's a big part, is the relationship between the Sanford Herald and the city of Sanford's leadership.
Yes, and R.J. Holly is an avowed Klansman. We'll get to that in a second, but when the Klan's national lecturer arrives in Sanford, R.J. Holly was requested to introduce him because he'd done such a great job propagandizing for the Klan. And so
the national organization of the Ku Klux Klan held a rally here in Sanford because of the uprising, because we had these Black cities. Like I said, Edenville was the first, the city of Goldsboro was second, and Blacks were doing, even though they were making 25 cents a day and someone else was making $8 million per year, they still were in control of themselves. They still owned their own property. They still owned their own land. They still made ends meet, had their own churches, businesses, our own schools, Goldsboro Elementary, Crooms Academy, Hopper, 7th Street School, all those schools within that time period where Blacks were not only surviving, even though it was 25 cents a day, that's still wrong, but they were able to thrive in that community.
Yes, and part of the reason wages were kept so low, as Peter Shaw noted in his book, he said masked men regularly marched through the Negro quarters to prevent Blacks from even thinking about asking for higher wages.
To intimidate them.
Yes, and Shaw worked for the Sanford Herald under R.J. Holly and worked in the Mayor Lake as well in his banks. This was somebody who certainly knew these people, but certainly knew Sanford. So that was the other part of this. The Klan's going to fill that role of wage regulation. And
so like mob.
Yes, very much so.
It's same type of mob mentality, to intimidate you, to take your wages, to take your money, to threaten you, and to have you basically work for nothing. And while this other group gets drastically rich.
Very much so. When Mr. Brunson, who owned property, owned a house that the Klan did not think he should own, he was Black. They told him in 1920, move. He refused. They took him out into the woods, beat him up, and said, move or we'll kill you. And we know this because it's a letter that James Weldon Johnson receives from an anonymous colored citizen, ostensibly Mr. Brunson, but that's in 1920. And so they are filling in a lot of roles, floggings, whippings, all of this, also transpires.
Also to take and threaten Blacks, but to also, what are the same way, as we say, history repeats itself. What's the other time period in history we see this done? We seen this done in Rosewood, as well as the Colby Massacre.
Yep.
Oh, Black Wall Street.
Tulsa,
Oklahoma. That's right. That's right. Here in Goldsboro, this happened everywhere. It wasn't just here. However, we're talking about the instances that led to the demise of Goldsboro and why we work so hard to build it back up so you all know the history.
Yes, and to give some context, the most violent state in all of during the peak of lynchings was Florida, the highest per capita lynching rate, triple that of Alabama and Mississippi.
And most people don't know that because when they think of Florida, they do not think of it as the South.
No, they think of palm trees.
They think of palm trees and the mouse. That's it. But Florida was your #1 state for lynchings, as well as Florida did not have the same type of enslavement plantations during the enslavement period, during those 400 plus years, during that time period. During that time period from 1619 to 1865, during that 200 plus year period, Florida did not have the same. We have the first Black man that arrived for enslavement in the state of Florida. We have them at 1565. 1565, when the Spanish came to conquer Florida. And then from there, we go on to learn that Florida did not play the same role as the rest of the South. Right,
and that's part due to the Spanish. I mean, the Spanish version of slavery was very different. You could purchase your own emancipation. Your children were not born slaves under Spanish Florida, and they sort of used this as a way to antagonize the British. Come on down from South Carolina and Georgia. Come into St. Augustine. We'll protect you. And this was sort of a political game they were playing. But they also saw it as somewhat of a moral issue. So it's a different type of slavery under Spanish Florida. And then as we get to the first lynching, it's Mr. Reed, who's accused of assaulting a white woman in Forest City. And Mr. Holly, with the Herald, writes, he says, summary vengeance will teach a much-needed lesson to the trifling Negroes who go through the county with no job and nothing to do, commit crimes of every sort. There is no place for such Negroes, and they need to be taught this lesson now.
And so what we hear from that, remember, that's the role the media played. And that's why it's always so imperative that Blacks have positive influence in the role of media. Because you just heard that narrative that Maxwell just said, that Blacks should do what?
They need to have jobs. This is all predicated on your worth is tied to where you're working, if you're working. And it's all about being shiftless and lazy, all these horrible tropes. But that's what Holly's throwing out.
Stereotypes as well.
Yes.
And stereotypes that are still today.
Yes.
And one, because of media. Yeah. Because this was in the Sanford Herald. This was in the newspaper.
Yes, and R.J. and the 50 men who were determined to get Mr. Reed from the jail cell, when they lynched him, his body stood at the railroad crossing in Longwood for a whole day. And school children were encouraged to see this. It was a very public way of showing this is who we are. This is what happens when you step out of place. For Black people as well as white people. Peter Straw was 12 years old when he went out and saw the body. 12 years old. And that's sort of indoctrination that's going to endure. And as we will see, that it's determined at the hands of unknown parties, but other newspaper reports said there was no effort at concealment. None of these people were masked.
No. So same way people aren't masked today, what's the same way people weren't masked yesterday. They took off their hoods. They didn't care.
Yeah, and as we see, the opening line was Negro assailant pays the penalty. Swinging in the morning breeze from the limb of a live oak tree at the railroad crossing lay the body of Will Reed. It says it bears moot testimony to the fact that such crime will not go unavenged in this county. That is what Mr. Holly writes about this lynching. And as you can see, that is going to create a fertile seedbed for the Klan. Sanford's Klan, we know, in 1921 has 50 members. However, by 1925, that may have been around 500. And
what was the population of Sanford back then?
In 1920, Sanford's population was around 5,888, most of whom were Black. So, as we move on here, this is when we learn that Mr. Lake's going to organize this Klan rally. We know this because...
And Mr. Lake is still the mayor of Sanford.
11-term mayor of Sanford.
Yes.
And we know this...
No term limits. Still no term limits in the city of Sanford.
Exactly. We know this because there's a letter from the Chase brothers, who are the largest... They own the largest celery packing
That's
place.
right,
Sanford.
chasing sons. And we have a lot of those pictures, yeah.
Yep.
They
And
were the largest.
they are writing back and forth, and at first they think it's State Attorney DeCotte who did this, and then they say, no, I learned on very good authority because this lead Klansman left behind a satchel that conveyed all this information, that Mayor Lake personally organized a Klan rally because he thought that his opponent, Mr. Stevens, was registering a large number of Negroes, was what was said.
Registering them to vote.
Yep, and he says, I learned today on very good authority that Mayor Lake feared there would be a strong Negro vote in the election and arranged with the Ku Klux Klan to give this demonstration for the purpose of intimidating the Negro vote, was what Mr. Chase wrote.
So what we've learned so far is that back then in early 1920s, and the earlier of that decade, in the 1920s, that Mayor Lake orchestrated the largest Klan rally because he was fearful of blacks voting, because blacks were more than were half or more for the population of the city of Sanford. So if they voted, they could control who was in their leadership. And he wanted to be in power. And as we later learned, Mayor Lake embezzled so much money from the city of Sanford that he did prison time as well.
3 years.
Yeah. So that's one. Two, the underlying instance that keeps happening is voter suppression. And it's something that we still deal with today.
Yes, and what we've learned is that Mr. Lake, this was not the only instance of Klan involvement that he had.
No, it's not.
And
he was not a nice guy.
No, Mayor Lake was a sort of shameless mountebank. Sanford did not pay off his debt until 1972. That's
few
how long
years
it took
ago.
to pay off Mayor Lake's debt. I mean, it's insane the amount of money he embezzled from his own people at his own bank. I mean, that's the thing that adds to it. And then as we get to, at this point, we know that Sanford's Klan has about 44 men in it, which is consistent with lynch mobs that it's out. There were 2 lynchings that almost happened, one in 1917, one in 1918. 500 people showed up for the one in 1918, and the person was innocent. And it's Mayor Lake who goes out and says, I pray, dear God, if this man is guilty, we got to string him up. But I don't think he is. So you guys need to go home. And what is he interrupted with? We want the end, all these horrible epithets. And they didn't get armed guards to take the innocent person back. But that's how powerful the bloodlust is. Not even Mayor Lake could stop a lynching once people wanted that bloodlust. And that was in 1918. But as we go to Presbyterian Church, that is the other main impetus. This is Mayor Lake's church. This is R.J. Holly's church. And this is going to be led by Ed Brownman, who is a very influential pastor. 37 years he spent there at this church.
What's the name of the church?
First Presbyterian Church. And it was the fastest growing church in Sanford. It was growing at a faster rate than the city. It eventually gets to about 517 members in 1924. And in 1922, R.J. Holly and Ed Brownlee are hosting this National Klan lecture. And this is when Holly requested to introduce him to what he described as one of the largest and most attentive crowds ever gathered in Sanford to hear this sermon on the principles of the Ku Klux Klan. This is in 1922. And a month later, Brownlee's going to do the same thing. And we see here, big crowd out to hear about the Klan. That was the Klan rally with the national lecturer, Colonel J.Q. Nolan. And to the right is that is Reverend Brownlee in full Klan regalia.
The Reverend of a church.
Who's 37 years he's pastor of this church. And as we will see, the flogging of a 74-year-old man from New Hampshire makes the front page of the New York World in 1925. And a flogging is a whipping, essentially. And this 74-year-old man claimed that 6 Klansmen took him out to an isolated stretch of woods and whipped him till he was unconscious. But the last thing they said to him was, we don't need hoods. There are 500 of us in Sanford ready to come out and get you if you say anything about this.
They were never scared.
No.
Because they were part of the leadership. Like all of the leadership, you had the media as well as you had officers, you had the police departments, all of that played a role because they were members of the Klan.
Yes, and what we learn about this is you would think this would be you wouldn't want this all over the front page of the New York World and of every newspaper.
They didn't care.
No, the head of Mayor Lake's bank responds with, well, Way must have been guilty to cause men to commit such an act. I mean, an innocent man. And the Herald's new editor, which is a guy named R.L. Dean, he calls Way a liar, and says that mob violence and lynchings were, quote, unheard of in this county. The day he writes that, you can't make this up, the day he writes it, Jack West is lynched by a group of men from Sanford. The day he writes it. And Jack West lynching is probably the most sordid in Seminole County. He allegedly assaulted a 3-year-old white girl. There's some dispute about that. The family never showed up in court, so he was acquitted. He's taken off the train. He was castrated while he was alive and then lynched. Again, an incredibly sordid piece of history.
That's the one that happened in Longwood?
Yes. And
I want to say they just recently put up, our friends in Longwood with the Longwood Historical Society, I think they recently just put up the markers for that lynching. And that's the only one that we have record of in Seminole County, because the rest of them were not as public.
Yes.
As that one. So that lynching is the one that's listed under the Equal Justice Institute as well, the National Institute of Lynching.
Yes, and what we also learned about the Jack West lynching is the sheriff's department found out about it when a Klansman from Sanford called them and said, "Hey, go look at this tree. You can go find Jack West's body." That's how they learned about it. And the Herald says, no, this wasn't Sanford men, this was Orlando men. Because, as they say, their newspaper got inundated with letters from much offended Northerners who said, "We're not going to eat Sanford celery. We're not going to come down here and visit your tourist town." Remember, Mirror Lake wants us to be a touristy place. He opens up the Hotel Forest
like
Lake.
now.
Yeah, which is the Mayfair Inn, which is, of course, a hotel that wouldn't house Jackie Robinson later on.
That's right.
And this is all from Mirror Lake. You would think that that would be enough to say, you know what? We've got to pull out of it. We got to stop this Klan activity. No! A year after that, they hold a Ku Klux Klan circus. A Ku Klux Klan circus.
Explain to the people what a Ku Klux Klan circus is.
Ah, well, here it is right here. It was essentially only local Klansmen could work it. So they were ticket salesmen. They were any sort of capacity at this circus.
So they were the host chapter, it sounds like.
Yes, they hosted this. The local Klan would host it. And they had a big parade, of course, before this rally on the fairgrounds. And you had the Presbyterian Church was involved in this as well. And guess who's there on opening night? Mirror Lake. He's there talking to the owner of the circus, Bob Morton. And if you notice, the Herald's advertisement here is going to say, "Bring the kiddies." This was an effort to get children into the Klan. And we know this because the Carrier boys of the Sanford Herald got free ringside tickets by the Klan and allegedly enjoyed this. This was a wonderful time for them. But you see this indoctrination, and this is 1926. So when we fast forward to civil rights, these people are 30, 40, 50 years old.
That's right, and now they're in leadership positions. They're the judges, they're the sheriffs. And like Mayor Lake, they're the mayors. They are the commissioners, state legislatures, because Mayor Lake, obviously, after he became mayor, he was the state legislator that stole the charter of Goldsboro.
Yes, and as we fast forward here, this is the Ku Klux Klan circus. Again, bring the kiddies. Lake is there. Florida's Klan governor.
And when we say kiddies, how young do you think they are at this circus?
6 or 8. I mean, that was what the Herald.
First and second grade.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and as we know, even with the Great Depression, you would think that would hasten Klan membership, and for the most part, it does. Not in Florida and not in Sanford. It doesn't appear. In 1929, June 17th, 50 hooded Klansmen walked through 2 Negro sections of Sanford, paraded through there. 1931.
One of them was Goldsboro, and
yes.
we have the rifles to prove that.
1931, a barber was thrashed soundly, told only straighten out your family affairs. 1920, Klansmen marched through downtown Sanford and set 2 crosses draped in American flags on fire. Very patriotic. And in 1932, 500 people, 200 of them were Klansmen from across the state, and Klanswomen, it should be said, gathered to hear a lecture in downtown Sanford on the principles and practices of the Ku Klux Klan.
And that's the role people do not talk about. But as you saw with the riots at the Capitol Hill March, and that there were quite a few women involved. And there were books about Southern women getting involved as Ku Klux Klan women.
Yes.
And the way that they would do it is they would say, "You are mothers. Could you imagine your children? This could happen to you. What if your daughter was assaulted? What if your son?" And that's how they got women to play a role in the Ku Klux Klan, and a very large role here in the city of Sanford, as well as with the Ku Klux Klan organization nationally.
Absolutely. And when Colonel Nolan came down to speak, that Herald's advertisement said, "Women especially urged to come." And these lectures were free. So it was designed all white women could go and see this lecture. And the only time that I could find on record that anybody in Sanford condemned the Klan for anything they did was when white businesses were impacted by the intimidation of potential black patrons in 1934. That's the only time I could find anything on it. And it was
They didn't want to lose the money from the black business, from the black payers, because we had to spend our money somewhere.
Right, and as the newspaper headline read, white businesses suffered considerably when these masked men showed up and they sent these black people running away. And it was Mayor Leckler who says, we got to stop this. And he says that because former mayor and then city commissioner V.A. Spear comes forward and says, yeah, my business is hurt. By the way, if you want to know who to go talk to about this, go talk to Judge Sharon. He's the head of the Klan. A county judge
was the head of the Klan. And we just made history because we just had our first black elected judge here in Seminole County this year.
And he is not only Sharon, a very influential judge, he's on the bench for 16 years. He won re-election the following year from this and ran for Congress. So this didn't impact him at all, at least not negatively. He's a charter member of the local Kiwanis Club, and he is
the Kiwanis Club.
Charter member and president. He's a very good friend of Mr. Holly. Him and Holly's wife chair the Sanford's Women's Club, or the White Women's Club, it should be said. I mean, these people are all very
Blacks
close.
Weren't allowed to go to these places. We weren't a member of the Kiwanis Club, the Rotaries. We weren't a member of all those places.
No, and they are all very good friends with Mr. Lake. R.J. Holly is one of the largest landowners, it should be noted. And on top of that, he's going to be the head of the Seminole Democratic Committee when Sharon's running for re-election. So,
and remember, this is before the parties changed, of course.
Yes, and these are the most influential members across religion, across politics, law enforcement, newspaper. I mean, if you wanted a Klan-run city, they've got just about every facet you can think of down packed. And that's what makes this so interesting, is that this is 1934. Again, fast forward a little bit. If he's head of the Klan in 34, he doesn't die until the 50s.
That's a long period to wreak havoc. And we also want to give you context in what's happening in the rest of the nation during this time. Here, you know, we see, and as Maxwell just said, you have the Klan dominating every lawful and every high member position within society, whether it be elected officials, whether it be judges, whether it be landowner. The most powerful man in real estate was Mr. Holly. And Mr. Holly was the head member of the Klan. And so think about this. That's in 1934. In 1910, we owned the manufacturing industry in the city of Chicago. We were building out the cars and the infrastructure in Detroit. We were having, you know, Black Hollywood and the galas and the Harlem Renaissance. All of this was going on up north during this time period. That's how far, and that's how the progress, and there was no progress in the city of Sanford when that Jim Crow laws. And that's what the South, and that's what the civil rights movement was about, because it was so far behind the rest of the country.
Oh, and the other thing, one thing that I did want to bring up is you have this World War I monument that sits in downtown Sanford.
That's right.
And there's no, they don't say anything about the fact that the black men who are on that monument, they're at the very bottom of this monument. And that's done intentionally. It goes up in 1918. Mayor Lake is mayor. This is during the height of the Klan there. And there's nothing that says, oh, and this went up during a very particular time frame, and that this is not a reflection of their valor. But that monument stands in direct opposition to that valor by putting them at the bottom beneath white men. There are only about 11 people who served from Sanford, and I think only 2 of them were black. And they're both at the bottom of a very large monument that still sits in downtown Sanford. I mean, that is a current projection of that white supremacy that Mayor Lake embodied. And that's just one of the ways that this stays with us now. I mean, look at Goldsboro. The neglect, the historic plight, the high numbers of unemployment, educational attainment.
And we can talk about COVID as well.
And COVID as well, yes. And again,
still remain. And we still have that monument, which a lot of people go and take pictures at. And it's still the centerpiece of downtown Sanford. Still today, right now, 2021, February 5th.
And the Civil War monument, I can't help but point this out. They have this picture of 2 men shaking hands. One of those men is a guy named Otis Tarver, who, when he dies, the Atlanta Constitution, the newspaper there, writes that he was the captain of Sanford's Klan. And that just sits there with no mention of that.
Mm.
And I mean, so again, these are the things that stay with us. This was when Sanford was built. The Sanford, at least as we know it, with Celery. This is who it's built by Klansmen, by white supremacists, by people who showed.
Well, no, hold up. Because Sanford was built by the black laborers.
Well, yeah, but I mean the people who I'm not with stealing Goldsboro and the celery industry.
Okay.
The backbone of that of black laborers, yes. These are the people who, well, I'll say this, who took credit for building it. The people who actually built it, you're right, were the black laborers, or people
that made that 25 cents a day, that turned it into that $8 million a year in 1921.
Right.
Now, the people who demised it and brought it down were the Ku Klux Klan.
Right, and these people are toiling long hours in the celery fields. W. George Allen, I don't know if you know. Right, excellent. I interviewed him a few months before he died.
And Mr. George Allen is from Midway, Florida, a proud resident and one of his native sons of Midway, Florida, and the first graduate of the University of Florida.
Yeah, and I think my computer's shut. I don't have any more slides. I guess that works. But one of the things that comes up with Mr. Allen is when I interviewed him, he was born, I think, around 1932 or 34, 36. He says one of his first memories was a person he knew, a neighbor of his, was dating this white man. This white person was dating this black woman that was a neighbor. And
interracial relationship.
Right. And the Klan showed up and said, no, and could date no white man's girl. And he kept doing it, and he got beaten up. They made him walk back naked, and this is in the 1940s. And he said his father gave him a gun because he thought the Klan was going to come on by. And he said, I remember sitting there. I was ready to kill a Klansman. That's what he told me. And it was a very riveting interview. But that is in the 1940s. And to give one other point of context, the head of Florida's Klan, a guy named W.H. Brewer, is in Sanford. That's 1951. Those are also the 1940s. John Paul Rogers, another head of the Florida Klan, comes in 1963, burns a cross on State Road 60. 2 days before a city election, and 8 people showed up in 1963. So the Klan doesn't die out. The Klan is not some fringe group.
No, and we know that the Klan never really died out here in Central Florida, nor in the city of Sanford or in Seminole County, unfortunately. And we see that now because the state of Florida now has more militant and more militia and more Klansmen, more hate and terrorist group, Proud Boys, all of those people included here in the state of Florida, more than anywhere else in the United States.
And you see this, they had the anti-mask protest in downtown Sanford not too long ago.
That's right.
There are a number of these groups that exist. If you drive in from Lake Mary, you go right by a giant Confederate flag outside of somebody's house. It's like, well, and look at the barn. Giant Confederate flags, and this is right next to Goldsboro.
What's the name of that establishment?
The Barn. The country line dancing bar. Right down way over here.
February 5th, 2021.
And again, you see this legacy. It's a long, painful legacy.
And I want to say legacy because legacy is something that has ended. It never stopped.
No, it continues to manifest itself. And again, the lack of infrastructure investment, the lack of regard that is shown for Goldsboro's residents.
Georgetown, Midway, all of the black communities, because Goldsboro wasn't the only black community that was tortured by the Klan. When he said that 2 places, actually black communities, that actually Klansmen rode through. Goldsboro was just one of those.
Absolutely. And on top of that, one of the larger problems was when Celery eventually does go out in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, most of the people, again, who were working, you didn't really need a high school education. Though many got them, and this made going into getting job prospects far more difficult. People in Midway in the 1980s were still using outhouses until they had to get the congressmen and senators to come down there and see this and get funding for it. That's the 1980s. Hold
on. All right, so let's bring this back into context. It is February 5th, 2021. I'm an 80s baby. And in the 1980s, there were people in Midway still using outhouses. Let's bring this back to 2021. The entire community of Midway still does not have plumbing infrastructure today.
Yes. And part of the reason for that is when they wrote the charters, the county, when they talk about roads, they said, well, you can only repair roads that have already been built. So that are new roads, basically, is how they did it. You can't go back and make new roads. You can only repair ones that exist.
That's right.
Which is why you see that and the infrastructure problems midway. I mean, they go back so long, and there are hearings on this in the 90s, and the 80s, and the 70s, and nothing of consequence really ever comes out of it, other than, oh, we'll get some money to you, and then the money never shows up, and you're still talking about it now.
They still saying that today?
But again, this is a long history that needs to be rectified. And all this talk about Celery City, oh, the Celery City Brew, we're going to bring back celery. Well,
Celery City Craft, Celery City Avenue, Celery City, Celery Keys, that is now flooding out. And the infrastructure over there.
And this is something that needs to be talked about. When we bring up the celery's history, there's a very ugly undercurrent that seldom gets mentioned, but I think needs to be at the center of this. That for a lot of people, the celery industry was not these old days where everyone was happy. This was a pretty horrible time for him to live.
And celery is definitely one of the hardest crops to grow, but also to pick. It's very laborious, very backbreaking because it only grows so high. You see the celery stalks into your local grocery stores, but it's a very painful and a very laborious, intensive labor type of work that Blacks did for many years to make that $8 million a year for the city of Sanford.
And
got paid 25 cents a day.
And Bob Thomas, when he ran for mayor, when he was asked by Russ White of the Herald, what do you think the problems are?
Mr. Thomas is our first Black city commissioner of Sanford, Florida. There were many petitions, and not even petitions. We actually had to sue for single member districts, sue the city of Sanford, the Black community of Goldsboro and Georgetown, sued the city of Sanford for single member districts to have representation onto the city council. Still today, actually, Ms. Sheena Britton was appointed by the commission as well when Mayor Jeff Triplett resigned. However, that is still the only elected position that we've ever had in the city of Sanford. The only Black that has been elected.
Yes.
Is that position still today.
And that lawsuit, I think, was in 1984. And I remember going through it, and some of these commissioners, one of them says, I think this is going to be the end of government. We need to go back to home rule, which is a Civil War term. And I mean, Lee Moore was the mayor back then. He was the head of the Chase Company. Who has a
park named after him.
He does.
Lee P. Moore Park.
He was the head of the Chase Company, and then it became Sunnyland. But he was the head of this company. And so there's a celery connection, and he's the one who's resisting this. You also had lawsuits at this time that come out about not having equal employment. Mm-hmm. And that goes to the federal government, and they say, excuse me, you have to fix this. You can't have one firefighter in your fire department or 4 policemen under Chief Butler, 2 of whom resign. You can't have this. And again, this is going to continue. And when Bob Thomas was asked, where do you think this goes back to? He says, celery. Go look at celery and the paternalism that emerged from that, and that is where these attitudes are going to come from, which is why understanding this and going through it, I think, is imperative.
And why it needs to be brought to the forefront to understand the issues and the issues that we still have today.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I want to thank you, Maxwell. Anything you want to add?
No, I just thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you for sharing your research with us. A lot of the research Maxwell did, he actually did here at the Goldsboro Museums. He actually came here for a few years working on his thesis and gathering up all of this. And this will be presented in a new book.
I'm working on writing. We'll see how far it gets. I've got a lot of work to do ahead of me because there's still so much to go through. It's just a matter of, do I want to break this down into several parts?
I don't know if you will ever get everything.
That's the trouble. You always want to get more, but you're never going to be satisfied.
I believe there are secrets still hid. We still have people that go out in their backyards and bury different materials that they wore back then. Because they're so ashamed of it now. Their families are ashamed of it when their family's members die and that they knew they were part of that history. So unfortunately, some of that history just dies off with them.
Yes, I have some oral histories that I think they'd be good. So, again, thank you so much for having me. It was an honor.
You're very welcome, Maxwell, and thank you so much. And I hope you enjoyed this presentation. All right. Y'all have a blessed one. Bye-bye.